One of the biggest questions that come, and I already had the question asked to me 3 times this morning, twice in the radio show here, and that is tomatoes. What do I do to keep my tomatoes alive in the summertime? How do I deal with the heat with my tomatoes? Because everyone wants to keep the tomatoes. And truth be told, not all your tomatoes will survive, even the next month. But some tomatoes can, and you can get them all actually to really do well and survive all the way through till fall and get another great harvest. But there's a couple key things that you need to know about your tomatoes. We ready to dive into that?
Well, we can definitely start off on tomatoes. Wow. I can't remember how many varieties of tomatoes, but it's significant.
Hundreds. 700 is the last I remember seeing on my list. It was about 700 varieties of tomatoes.
But like all things, maybe what percent of those would even grow in Arizona or thrive?
There's about 50 varieties, I'd say, that we would say, hey, these work and they can thrive here in Arizona. Now, different ones at different times.
And so from that 50, narrow it down to how many will go year-round or multiple years?
Well, to keep it simple for you, we're going to go to, there's 2 different classes. There's determinate tomatoes and there's indeterminate variety tomatoes. Determinates have a determined endpoint when they produce. They produce one cycle, one season, that's it. It's more, sometimes they'll call them bush tomatoes. So a bush tomato type is really, it's a determinate variety. It's only going to go a season and it's done. So finding out what variety of tomato first is probably your most important. So categorize by that, determinate or indeterminate. If it's a determinate or bush variety, it's done. Your season's over. Better to just cut the thing out.
So that's like annual, perennial. Why do they have to make it different for vegetables versus flowers?
I don't know.
Okay.
But it is what it is, so we'll work with that. Indeterminate or vining
one more
type.
thing I got to memorize here.
Right. We're trying to make this simple on you. Come on. So the indeterminate variety or vining tomatoes, those ones can go multiple years because they can continue to grow and continue to produce fruit. And those ones are going to be your highest likelihood of continuing on for multiple seasons. And so that vining type, then within that class, I would say there's really just 3 varieties that I recommend during the summer months that are the easiest to produce through the summer. And they're all 3 are indeterminate varieties. The first one is a Sweet 100, which is a cherry type tomato. And really everything in the cherry class is pretty useful, and you can use that. I mean, the second one is also in that same class of the vining indeterminate, and then also a cherry type. And I'm forgetting the name of it. I think it's a large cherry tomato. It's just a basic large cherry tomato. It's an heirloom variety. And then the third one's the yellow pear tomato. Now, the yellow pear tomato doesn't look like your typical tomato, but that one will produce.
It's called yellow pear for a reason.
Yellow pear tomato. It looks literally like a little yellow pear. They're very productive, amazing producers. Kind of a plum size type, not plum size, a plum tomato size. Like if you find them in the store, little cherub tomatoes, those kind of things. About that same size, a little bit of an elongated look, but they're yellow and look like a pear. And those ones, when it comes down to it, you can get a tomato plant to survive, whether it be determinate or indeterminate, with a little bit of shade. 30% to 45% shade is sufficient in order to cool them off enough. But that's to keep the leaves alive. Okay, so that's keeping the leaves alive. So number 1, keep the leaves alive, which keeps the plant alive. You're going to have to add a lot more water. You're going to have to feed it about once a month because it's going to burn through nutrient a lot faster during the summer. And the other component, though, is just to acknowledge the fact that pollen has a death temperature. And for most of your traditional tomatoes, so a lot of your heirloom types, your in hand, your cutting, your slicing tomatoes, there's so many different varieties in that category that work well in Arizona. The beefsteaks, Better Boys, Early Girls, those are all great tomatoes, but their pollen pretty much deactivates at about 95 degrees. And so if you don't have pollinators active and around your plant at temperatures lower than when the temperatures are below 95 degrees, there just won't be any fruit producing. You'll have green leaves, but you won't have any fruit. Now, with the 3 types that we talked about, the cherry type and the yellow pears, their temperature range for their pollen activation goes up to about 105. So still anything above 105, the pollen's not actually going to work. It's just even if you've got pollinators there, it's just not going to work. So you need to have a couple things. The temperature needs to be low enough for the pollen to work, and you have to have pollinators pollinating during that time. But again, first you got to make sure the plant actually survives.
And all these plants tomato varieties that go through the summer, they're all very small. Now, is this like, is it easier for the plant and the leaves to protect the fruit where like your big beefsteak just out in the sun would bake it?
It's part of that. They can hold their temperature a little bit better through the smaller fruit, it would seem, because as the temperatures get higher and you got a large fruiting tomato. So I've got some beefsteaks at home right now. I've also got some Mr. Stripeys and some other cool ones, and they're still producing right now. But the ones that end up in a little bit more of the sun don't have the shade from my tree. I use trees as most of my shade cover in that part of my garden. And they actually they got so big that they started getting sunburned because they were touching out on the outside. And the skin is a little bit thinner on those types of tomatoes, the outer skin. Whereas the cherry types, they often have a little bit thicker skin, as well as, and so they can hold their moisture a little bit better. They can regulate their temperature a little bit better. Another thing we often see that happens, people are seeing it a lot right now as well, is blossom end rot at the very bottom of those tomatoes. That's a calcium deficiency. It's not related to the heat directly, but indirectly it can be because of this other component we talked about before. As the temperatures increase, it burns through nutrients a lot faster. And so if you don't keep adding nutrient to your soil around your plants or spraying a calcium spray or something that has calcium in it on the plant leaves at night, it won't have enough nutrient to then compensate for that blossom end rot effect. Again, it's a calcium deficiency in the plant, and you can solve it quickly for future fruits by literally spraying a calcium type spray on the underside of the leaves at night, and it will draw the nutrient in, and then getting some good calcium based or just good balanced organic fertilizers typically will have the calcium in it already that the plant can then uptake and help your tomato survive and thrive in all reality.
On tomatoes. And I know we won't spend the whole hour talking on them, but
no, but we could, and everybody knows it, right?
Since we're already here, a couple things. I had heard that you're not supposed to feed tomato plants to animals.
Well, it's the plants themselves aren't the greatest for them because it's a nightshade family, and so there are some relevant toxins existent within that class of plant. And so we typically do not feed anything in the nightshade class to our animals. Even my goats and sheep, goats with multiple stomach scenarios, they got a different digestion, or even the cows. Cool part is they usually just don't eat it anyway. I mean, even if you offered it to them, they often won't eat it. So certainly don't force feed them. But some of the newer varieties, I would say newer varieties of animals, they may not be as smart as the heirloom variety of animals. And that's something we found.
Diluted gene pool there?
Maybe a little bit. They're not trained in the wild, I guess you could say. And so they don't have that instinct to avoid certain things that would otherwise kill them or harm them.
And you said it's from the what family? The
Nightshade.
Nightshade.
Yep.
What other nightshade plants are common that we shouldn't be repurposing to our furry friends?
Straight the nightshades. There is a whole name of plant. I mean, there's wild nightshades that are out there. And so pepper plants, I often don't do those. We won't feed those to them. Eggplants, I would also include in that category. And so those are things that just the plants themselves, I wouldn't recommend feeding those to your animals. But they compost well.
Okay.
They compost well. Feed it to your compost pile. They'll eat it.
That heat from the compost will, whatever toxins in there, it'll bake out.
Right. And now we're just rotating it back to soil. And that's it. It doesn't have to go through an animal first in order to go back to soil. So
now, have you ever seen the ketchup and fry tomato plant?
The ketchup and fried tomato plant? Okay, so you're talking about the ones where they've grafted it onto a potato.
Yes.
Yes, I have seen those.
Have you ever tried that?
I have not personally tried that myself, but just from the science of it all, it's a determinate variety. It's not going to be an indeterminate because obviously you're going to harvest the whole thing out anyway. And so it really cool idea. My perspective on it is for $36 to get one of those, I can plant both a tomato plant and potatoes at the same time, but in different beds and get twice as much or
much
times
more
as
harvest.
Much for harvest. But if I've got a really small space and I want to have some cool conversations with neighbors and guests, I would totally do it.
Try that. Okay. We started off hitting tomatoes. That is, people will spend a lot of time trying to make them survive through the summer. I think there's just some kind of connection people have with tomato plants that they don't want to start over. But in a lot of cases, it's not only faster, cheaper, easier, but Justin went through the last segment talking about the tomatoes that do survive through the summer. If you're talking about those other ones that don't survive, if you happen to have all the right conditions to limp a beefsteak tomato plant through the summer, how good of a production are you going to get in the fall from something that, has survived on, life
through the heat? It can be 3 times as much production as a restarted tomato in that next season. So you can have 3 times as much, and so there is some incentive to do it. But if you go beyond kind of the 3rd season of it, then we start having some other issues that can cause some major problems to the tomato. So I think there's some value to it if you got the space for it, because they take up more space. But everybody's got a different.
So it can be justified. Okay,
it can be justified.
I kind of had it in my mind if it was stressed all through the summer, that by the time it came back into time to reblossom and create produce, that it would just be, you'd be working with something that was only functioning at 50% because of the amount of stress it had to go through the summer.
Yeah, and I think for most gardeners, especially that are growing their own tomatoes, they do it because they love that flavor. You can't beat the flavor of a homegrown, fully ripe, tomato. And on top of the emotional nature that people have with plants when you're growing them yourself, it's hard to justify cutting it out regardless of the monetary gain or loss, relative to it. It has nothing to do with the money. It's something that you've brought to life and you've kept alive, and you find great value in what it produces. And that's the heart of a gardener, there's so many people and gardeners I know, it's like they can't take out any plant.
I do have a hard time thinning.
Right. We helped a client thin some pears off of their new pear tree just yesterday. And I was like, we got to take some of those off. And she's like, but they look so good. It's like, we got to focus on root growth. This is the first year of this pear. It's like, you're going to have, for every one you pull off, you get 3 more next year. Okay, I can do it. And that's the reality of it. It's getting to know there's a balance between the heart and also the value of growing the product and stuff itself. So,
well, let's see if we can help Matt out with his tomatoes and see if we can't get him through the summer. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, guys. Great talking to you as always. And you've triggered something with thinning. I hate thinning fruit off of my trees. So that's just painful to hear.
Yeah, you're not alone. We should start a help group, a support group for all of us. And there will be many. There will be many.
You thin my trees, I'll thin yours.
There we go. It's always easier to do it for somebody else. How can we help you, Matt?
Well, guys, great talking to you. Great talking to you as always. I've got 20 some odd tomato plants in my garden. And for the first time, I have yet to have a single red tomato. Lots of green fruit, but nothing is turning red. And I don't know if it's just the weather. I don't know if it has something to do. I did redo the irrigation for all of my gardens, but everything looks healthy. The plants are all big and full, but nothing is reddening. So I just don't know if there's something I'm doing wrong, something I should be doing, or if it's just one of those seasons that is different than any other season we've had in the last, 10 years or so.
So tell me about the varieties you've got there.
Oh, good heavens.
I know you got 20 of them. Is it 20 different varieties?
No, it's probably 7 or 8 varieties. They're all ones that I've done before. I've got the yellow pear. I've got the black cherry tomatoes. So they're all the cherry-sized tomatoes, all the smaller ones that that I've had success with in the past.
And are they currently shaded or covered?
They've got partial shade. So I've got 2 shade sails up, so they get shade probably about half of the day.
Okay, so a couple things of thought on it is making sure that they get some good morning sun and then maybe just the afternoon shade. Maybe if we even open up a little bit more light onto them might help them ripen up. Another fun idea that might help trigger the ripening process, if the fruit is to the size that you think they should be, then what I might recommend is actually get some ripe bananas or some other ripe fruit and actually stick them down on the ground so that the hormone actually will kind of be released, and it actually can help trigger the action of ripening for the fruit itself. And maybe try that first on one plant that you see is looking good. Maybe put a little bit of gauze type fabric over the top of it so it kind of holds a lot of that vapor from the ripening fruit in it, and see if that helps trigger the action of ripening. So it just sounds like it hasn't triggered it yet. For some reason, your plants haven't been triggered to fully ripen if they've gotten to the size they need to be. So this might be a little trick to kind of, little chem hack.
All right. I will try both of those. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.